nation, where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.
Big hand please for Mr. Terry Boardman.
Good evening all. Thank you, Andy and Helen, for inviting me back again. Nice to be back in Burgess Hill. Is this okay where I'm holding the mic like this?
Yes, I'm good.
Yeah? I don't normally use a mic, but I've been asked to this evening, so I'll do my best. Right, I'm glad to see there's a clock at the back, so I will try not to overburden you with everything I have to say, and it will keep me on my toes, time-wise. Well, as Andy said, there certainly is a very great deal going on at the moment. And I chose this particular title here, Right at the End of the Tunnel, question mark, when I saw a video on Telegram, and the video was in 3 parts. The first part showed a lot of famous politicians from various countries. This was about the end of last year, by the way. And they were all using this same phrase. There is light at the end of the tunnel. We are seeing light at the end of the tunnel. They were talking about COVID, of course. They were saying, implying that COVID was coming to an end. Light at the end of the tunnel, light at the end of the tunnel. Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson, many people were using this phrase. That was the first part of the video. The second part of the video showed a romantic couple in a car in a railway tunnel. And they were driving on the railway tracks through the railway tunnel. Perhaps some of you have seen this. And they went on for a bit, and then they saw what looked like the light at the end of the tunnel. Oh, good, they must have thought. But then, to their horror, they realised that it was the light of an oncoming train coming the other way. So, of course, screaming and panicking, they ran the car into reverse and they had to back out of the tunnel as fast as they could. That was the second part. And the third part was this band, who some of you may know, a British band from the 80s called Half Man, Half Biscuit. And they specialised in sort of satirical, political type rock songs. You can still see them on YouTube. And one of their songs is called Light at the End of the Tunnel. Meaning, is it the light at the end of the tunnel? No, it's the light of an oncoming train. So their song a bit downbeat, shall we say. And the reason why this occurred to me or struck me, was because I'd seen a lot of people who were saying that COVID seems to be coming to an end. They thought it was coming to an end. And they also thought that it would mean the end of the present system, the end of the present kind of economy. Everything would be imploding. And the result of all of this would be a wonderful new world would soon come out of all of this. And I'm afraid I felt, no, I think that's rather unlikely. For a while, yes, at least. And I'll explain why in this talk. Right. Okay. So these are the things I'm going to talk about tonight, which you will have seen in the Changing Times website. The need to understand where we are in the human story in this critical century, and why it's such a critical century, the 21st century. Rudolf Steiner has been a big influence in my life. I've had basically 3 influences in my life. Where I grew up, in Chester, very ancient Roman city. That's where I grew up until 18. And I went to Manchester, became a man, studied history, Manchester University. And then I went to Japan after I graduated. And in Japan, I taught English for 7 years in Tokyo and Osaka. And that was, obviously deep shock, deep immersion, cultural learning of all kinds. So that was the second real major formative influence in my life, I think. And I was lucky also to meet a woman there who I spend the rest of my life with, and still I'm doing so. And then the third thing was, when I came back to this country in 1981, more or less immediately came into contact with the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, who, as you know, died in 1925, a long time ago. But I found, to my great interest, that this man, what he said, answered a lot of the questions which had arisen in me when I was in Japan. East-West questions, spiritual, religious questions, questions about the relationship between cultures, how England and Japan can possibly relate, how to bridge this seeming gap. So, Steiner helped me a lot to understand things, and particularly helped in connection with current events in relation to, for example, the First World War, which was going on during his lifetime. And I had long felt, before I knew Rudolf Steiner, who I only encountered when I was 29, that the First World War was like the crucible of the century which everybody in this room was born into. Have you ever wondered why we were born into the 20th century? What is it with the 20th century, with these two world wars and this Cold War, and all the other things that happened? But I long felt that the First World War was like a crucible for much that happened in the 20th century. And I was very interested to find out, from the age of 12, what that conflict was all about. So, how Rudolf Steiner saw the modern age as the etheric presence of Christ and the physical incarnation of Ahriman. If you're not familiar with the work of Rudolf Steiner at all, could I just take a brief show of hands? Is there anybody here who feels they're really not familiar at all? Please, it does help me to know that. Thank you very much. The name Ahriman Rudolf Steiner chose, it's a name of a Persian spirit, the Persian spirit of untruth or deception. And in our or here, the ancient spirit of darkness, lies. And the name which we are more familiar with, of course, in the West is Satan. Satan and Lucifer being two different beings. I'll come to that later on. So how Steiner saw the modern age as that of the etheric presence of Christ, the etheric presence of Christ, Christ in the invisible realm, in the realm of the angels. The spirit, that part of the spiritual world which, as it were, is closest to our own, but is not physical. And in contrast to that, the physical incarnation of Ahriman. I'll come to this later. Thirdly, the roots of the current Ukraine situation, the Anglo-Russian antagonism, and what he called the ghosts of Rome. How Roman Empire is still very much living with us in our culture today in various ways. The relationships between US, UK, EU, Russia and China. Then transhumanism, AI, and plans for what I've called the threefold abolition of the human being. The abolition of the human spirit, the abolition of the human soul, and now, in the 21st century, the abolition of the human body. And I think you all know what I'm talking about there. We'll get to that later. And then, the equally threefold cultural, political, economic solution to the world crisis, which could offer a positive way out of the current situation that we're in. So before I go any further, I must not forget my water. Right. So, understanding where we are in the human story. Now, this is a lot. So I'm being quite demanding with you today, but I hope it will make sense. We need to try and grasp this in order to make sense of the kind of specific, more contemporary issues I'm going to be referring to later. So first of all, when are we in 2022? We think in 2022, 22 years after Christ, after the birth of Christ. And these numbers just go on and on and on. That's our normal understanding of our chronology, is it not? And then before Christ, they went back and back and back and back. And the numbers just continue. It's a bit like the numbers that just continue when we talk about the beginning of how long the dinosaurs lived, or back to the Big Bang and so on. But actually, as we'll see, there are certain qualitative rhythmical elements to these various dates and numbers. So if we take this 1 year we're living in now, we see that it exists at the intersection of all kinds of rhythms and cycles within history, which are really quite complicated, like in a symphonic piece of music almost. So first of all, now these first two, I'm not going to talk about these tonight. I'm only going to point them to you and invite you to look into this yourself. That this year mirrors 2022 BC. So if you just take if this idea is new to you, that for example the Christ event 2,000 years ago is the center of human evolution or human history on this planet, if you don't agree with that, or you think you're not comfortable with that in some way, I can only invite you, just for the purposes of this evening, just take that as a kind of assumption or hypothesis, if you will, and then just dwell on it. And in view of what I'm going to present you tonight, see if that then makes sense to you in terms of how you experience current events in history. So where we are now mirrors approximately 2000 BC. Now, as far as I'm aware, for example, no scholars, biblical scholars, are of the opinion that Abraham lived much earlier than 2000 BC. There are all kinds of dates proposed for him, somewhere between 1500 and 2000 BC. But the time that we are in at the moment is approximately corresponding to that time at the beginning of the story of Abraham. Then we see that 2022 correlates to the year 138 BC. Now, why should that be? Because, as I said before, history, in a way, is a kind of musical structure. And we'll see that there are 7 periods. There have been 7 great periods of history since the Great Flood. And these 7 periods are like the 7 intervals in the octave. Of course, in an octave there are 8 notes, but the first note and the 8th note are the same, more or less. So the key is the 7 steps to the octave. And in each of these 7 phases of history, we can see that they have these 7 periods. And there are correlations between these 7 periods. 7 periods of growth or development, if you will, in each of these historical periods. So where we are at now, 609 years into our present cultural age, which I'll explain to you later, is the 5th age, known to, I'm sure many of you, the age of Pisces. And then before that was the age of Aries. We are 609 years into the age of Pisces today, 2022. Now, 609 years into the previous age, the 4th age, that was the age of Aries. That was the year 138 BC. So I just invite you, just look into that for yourself. What was going on in the year 138 BC? And not only in the West, of course, but also in China. What's going on in China today? It doesn't mean necessarily only right, of course, in this year. Just look around the 130s, for example, 130s BC. Then in the 2020s, we are about to enter the 3rd phase, 2020 to 2029, of the 5th cultural age. That's the one we're in now. It started in 1413 and will end in 3573. I'll explain that again in a minute. 2022 is 2 years into the new air phase, which started in 2020, just 2 years ago, of the Jupiter-Saturn impulse that began in 1603. 2022 is 122 years after the reopening of the doors of natural clairvoyant perception, which happened in 1900. Now, that's a really significant thing. Again, I'll mention that later. 2022 is 43 years into the 2nd century, 1979, of the deepening Michael age, the Archangel Michael. So the Michael age began in 1879, And the second century of that was 1979. So the impulses that the Archangel Michael stands for are deepening now in this second century. That's part of the background to the age in which we live. 2022 is the 22nd year of the 21st Christian century. So we're in this 21st century. What does that mean to be 21? It's when you're adults traditionally, just when your adulthood begins. When you take responsibility for your life as an individual. But now humanity is taking responsibility for our life on this planet. Taking responsibility for this planet. 2022 is the 22nd year of the third Christian millennium. And this movement from the second millennium to the third millennium, and you'll hear me refer to this a lot, the movement from number 2 to number 3. This is a real key for understanding the time in which we live. The time of dualism to the time of threefoldness or triadism or trinity. In 2022, we approach the 2000th anniversary in the years 2030 to 2033 of the 3 years of Christ. From baptism in the Jordan to the crucifixion, resurrection and ascension. So we're coming up to that, 2030. And you'll notice that the global elite are all focused on what particular year? 2030. Agenda 2030 is what everybody is talking about. But not for this reason. Not to celebrate this reason. 2022 is 33 years after 1989. 66 years after 1956, and 99 years after 1923. And this 33-year cycle or 33-year rhythm is a historical factor which Rudolf Steiner brought forward in 1917. It's based on the etheric cycle of the life of Jesus Christ. 2022 is almost 3 times 33 years after the beginning of the human vision of Christ in the etheric, in the angelic realm, which starts, according to Steiner, in 1933, saying from 1933 people will begin to have visions of Christ in the angelic realm. In 2022, now we'll look a bit more on the darker side. In 2022, we have been experiencing the incarnation of Ahriman since 2000. And this is my view, this is not what Steiner said. I'll share with you later on what he said about the incarnation of Ahriman. But I've given a lot of thought to this over the years, and it seems to me that this process began in the year 2000. I'll explain why later. 2022 is 7 or 8 years before the probable emergence of the human vehicle of Ahriman / Satan in 2029, 2030. And again, I would invite you to just think back over over your lifetimes actually, but particularly since the 1970s, early 1970s, and particularly again since 9/11 and the beginning of this century. And think of how things have accelerated by an incredible amount since that time. It's as if there is somehow a tremendous foot on some enormous accelerator going on in our world today. And I would submit that what that is basically the atmosphere which is accompanying the approaching incarnation of the being we call traditionally in the West as Satan, and to which Rudolf Steiner gave the name Ahriman. 2022 is the penultimate year of the window of Sorath's third attack on humanity. Now, many of you may not be familiar with Sorath. This is the name of the being who is referred to in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, the being of the number 666. And Sorath is the letters of that name correlate to those numbers. You know that in Hebrew there were no vowels, but there are only consonants, S, R, TH. Surt. 666. Now this particular being, Steiner pointed out, attacks humanity every 666 years. I'll explain that later too. The last, we're living in a window, so to speak, of this attack, which began in the early 70s and which will end next year. And the centre of that window was 1998. All right, now I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. Just to explain, first we're going from the zodiac level, so to speak. Then we'll come to the planetary level. The spring point moves through 1 degree of the zodiac every 72 years. And the spring point is that point where the day and the night are of equal length. And when you look, when the sun rises on that day, behind the sun is a sign of the zodiac. And so we can see that at the spring point there is a particular sign of the zodiac there, and a particular degree of the sign of the zodiac. Now in the equal zodiac, every sign has 30 degrees, since Babylonian times. And 30 times 72 is 2,160. And that's where we get this number, 2,160 years is the length of time of a cultural age. The age of Aries, the age of Aquarius, the age of Pisces, and so on. And so we can see from observation, from calculation, that the spring point entered the sign of Aries in 1946 BC. And it entered the sign of Pisces in 215 AC after Christ. But the cultural ages of Aries and Pisces began in 747 BC and 1413 AC, respectively. So? How is that possible? Let's look at that. Here's a quote from a book by Hugo Winkler, who was a specialist in Babylonian culture, written in 1902. Quote, "The calendar reform, which determined the entrance into Aries, is attested to historically. It was carried out by King Nabonidus of Babylon. The age of Aries is reckoned from the year 747 BC, the beginning of his reign, and this date was utilized by the entire astronomy chronology of antiquity." And then Claudius Ptolemy, who, the Alexandrian mathematician and astronomer, on whom particularly our tropical astrology in the West is based, wrote in his book Almagest, quote, "From this date, namely 747, we possess the ancient observations continued practically to the present day." So he wrote that in about 150 after Christ. So the astronomical age of Aries began in 1946 BC, but the cultural age of Aries began in 747 BC. If you want to go into this in more detail, then have a look at this book here, Hermetic Astrology Volume 1 by Robert Powell. So the question is, what accounts for the 1199-year gap or delay in the astronomical and the cultural ages? This might seem a bit abstruse, but it really is important for us to grasp where we are in history. Well, this, I submit, is what explains the 1200-year or 1199-year gap, the so-called Venus pentagram or Venus pentacle. And you probably know that every 8 years, Venus makes 5 beautiful conjunctions with the Sun. And the movements of Venus are extremely regular and harmonious, which is why Venus has been used by many cultures for, including, for example, the Aztecs, for astronomical and astrological research and observations. So we see, for example, here, if you start here, June 1988, so if we are looking for the Earth, and we look to Venus, and then we look to the Sun, Venus and the Sun are more or less in the same position, aligned with each other. And then behind them is the sign Gemini. And then a couple of years later, we see Venus with the sign in Capricorn behind them, January 1990, and then September 1991, Leo, and then April 1993, Aries, and November 1994, Scorpio. So this invisible pattern emerges, which is a very beautiful geometric pentagram. That's simply the same thing in a computer display. So this, the point is that these positions, after the 5th position, when you come back to the 6th position, it's slightly further along on the zodiacal periphery, you see. That means that over 1199 years, 1200 years, these 5 points of meeting will all rotate right around the zodiac. And then they will come back to approximately where they were 1199 years earlier. So this is called the rotation of the Venus pentagram. And I would submit that this is what is like the cosmic transformer, if you will, that steps down a new cosmic impulse from the zodiacal level down to the level of human history and culture. But we can only convince ourselves of that when we observe history itself. So these are the cultural ages, not the astronomical ages. I hope I've made that clear. The cultural ages, and you see there, that date 747 again, the age of Aries. This is Cancer, Gemini, Taurus, Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn. And these are the 7 cultural ages since approximately the time of the flood, which would have been about 2,000 years before this. The Indian epoch, the Persian epoch, the Middle Eastern epoch, the Mediterranean epoch, the North European epoch, the East European epoch, and the American epoch, by which is meant the whole continent of America, not the United States. And please notice that, as I said before, this musical relationship between, as in music, you have a kind of musical relationship between the 3 notes of the lower tetrachord, do, re, mi, and then the 3 notes of the upper, sol, la, ti. There's a relationship between those around the center point of fa in the middle. So fa in the middle is this 4th epoch, the Mediterranean epoch, the age of Aries, from 747 BC to 1413. That's the middle point. Then around this middle point, you see a certain relationship between the Middle Eastern 3rd epoch, Taurus, that's Egypt, Babylon, Chaldea, and Assyria, Sumer, and so on. And our present epoch, which began in the 15th century. So in our present time, many aspects of the age of Taurus are actually resurrected in various forms, various cultural forms. And so it will be in the next epoch, the 6th epoch, age of Aquarius, many aspects of the 2nd epoch will resurrect, so to speak. So here we see the cultural ages. And the important point to grasp here is that in each of the cultural ages, a different part of the human being is developed. So we see that, we see that in the age of Taurus in the Middle East, the key concern was the developing of human faculties of feeling. And morality and values were seen in that time, in particular, in relation to beauty and ugliness. That's very much the case in Japan, in the old Shinto culture, which is again goes back way before the 4th epoch. The values of that which is clean and that which is unclean, that which is beautiful and that which is dirty or ugly. And at that time, in the third epoch, what we call politics today didn't exist. Society was governed, so to speak, and determined by the priesthood, by the kings, the pharaohs, who were in fact demigods, and the priests who were around them and facilitated the impulses from the spiritual world through these demigods to the people. There was no politics then. There was no separate world of economy, no separate world of politics. Everything was suffused by the will of the gods, by religion. Then the age varies. We see that now in this time, 747, 1413 after Christ, in the Mediterranean culture, the human being really begins to think for himself. Instead of the gods are thinking for me, or through me, now the human being begins to feel, I am thinking. I am thinking. And we see, particularly in Greece, the beginnings of logical thinking, the beginnings of philosophical thinking. We see similar developments, not quite the same, but similar kinds of developments in China, with Confucius, and in India, with the Indian philosophers, culminating with the Buddha, for example. And the tremendous Buddhist logic and Buddhist philosophy in the Abhidhamma, which developed in the centuries after the Buddha. So this is a time of the development of thought. What is true, what is untrue? What is the truth or the untruth about, for example, the great questions such as birth and death? And we find that in this period in particular, great arguments went on. As people lost the capacity to have real spiritual vision, and in its place, they gained the capacity to be able to think for themselves intellectually. It was a new gift for human beings, a new capacity. But that also meant that human beings, because they were thinking for themselves, they started to fall into error in various ways. They started to fall into dispute. And this is the time, of course, when we see in the Western world all the disputes develop between the different streams and sects of religion. But we also notice that this was the time when politics and the law developed in Greece and Rome. The kind of politics and law concepts which we still work with today. Democracy, monarchy, aristocracy, constitution, senate, political parties, the People's Party, the plebeians, the patricians, all these different concepts were developed in this time when people began to think for themselves about social order. Then when we could move on into our age, the age of Pisces, in Northern Europe, then the question becomes not so much beauty, of course beauty still goes on, not so much truth, of course that goes on too, but now the question becomes, what is the good? How can I put my newly won capacity to think in the service of the good? You can have an extremely clever 12 or 13-year-old boy in his bedroom with his computer, and he can be far more clever with his computer, and clever in his head, and his calculations and so on than perhaps many of us in this group. But he's not using his thinking in a moral or ethical way, or putting his thinking in the service of the good. And that is the point now. We have the capacity to think for ourselves. We gained that in the fourth epoch. Now we have to put that in the service of what is good. And especially we have to do that in this period, which as you see has a long way to go yet. We have to do that in the realm of economy. Because it is now economy which is the centre of our age. Not so much religion, not so much politics, but economy. In this age, the age varies, politics and law sought to emancipate themselves from religion. It took a long time. Even in the Middle Ages, there were endless struggles going on in the continent between the emperors and the popes, for example. But in our time, we can see how economy is trying to free itself, emancipate itself, both from religion. It hasn't done that yet in places like Iran or Saudi Arabia, and also from politics. And that's what's happening in the West. Economic life is trying to develop its own being. Now, we can have a big discussion about that, because of course that disturbs many people. But the question is, this will happen. The question is, can it happen in such a way that this economy will be an economy which is dedicated to the good, and not just to me, myself, and I, self-interest. So, the other aspect of our time is individualism, the development of individualism. In the fourth epoch, when people were trying to develop their own thinking and trying to understand what is the truth of matters, they still very strongly felt themselves to be part of a collective. Not the old kind of blood collective so much, which you have in the third epoch, but rather the collective of religion, the collective of village, the collective of polis in Greece, city-state. But in our epoch, now we are beginning to free ourselves from those kind of collective thoughts. So we're beginning to understand that we are individuals in our own right. And so in our time, you start to get even the concept of global citizen emerging. And people begin to say to themselves, well, there's just me and there's the world. I relate to the planet. Many young people feel that's what they relate to these days. They're not concerned about their nation, or their race, or their tribe, or their clan. They're just concerned about themselves, maybe their own personal friends, and their own personal friends on the other side of the world who they can talk to in the computer, but the planet. Something perhaps missing in the middle there, in my opinion. Then we go on into the next epoch, Aquarius, which will be the time of Eastern Europe, the Slavic peoples. And this will become very important when we turn later to talk about Russia and Ukraine, and the West's relationships with that. And what humanity will work on in that era or epoch will be a kind of higher communal feeling, which we cannot really even begin to conceive of quite yet, but which the Slavic peoples already have an inkling of, and which they also have a kind of feeling for. Very much wrapped up with the Russian word or Slavic word mir, which means a whole bunch of things, from world, cosmos, village, community. So this will be a time of a new social life based on a new heightened feeling quality. Hard for us to grasp that yet, because we're wrestling with individualism. We're wrestling to free ourselves from the collectivities of the fourth epoch. Then the last epoch, Capricorn, which is very far in the future, the time of America, the American epoch. That will be a time of a new communal will force, willpower. Again, very difficult for us to perhaps to conceive what that will be like. A new kind of moral will. And a new kind of theocratic rule will develop. Only it won't be a theocratic rule by a new priesthood. It will be a new kind of theocratic rule in the sense that all of us have a new communal will, a kind of priesthood of all believers, if you know that phrase. This is just an overview of the different cultural ages. We'll see how that relates to the present year and the issues we have to consider that are going on now. So the age of Pisces then, its real aim is to summarize our consciousness in all activities. This is the age of what Steiner called the consciousness soul. We try to be super conscious about everything we do. Even every sort of item we buy from the shops, is covered in information, is it not? You spend ages just looking at all of the information on the carton of milk or orange juice. Not only all the logos and the zappy little cartoons and emojis, but all the little details and all of the calories and all of this information, because we want to be so conscious about what we're doing, you see. And you might think that's a load of nonsense. But the point is, that's what we do, that's what people want in the present time. There's a drive to do that. A drive to be scientifically and objectively conscious. We're striving to become autonomous, spiritually self-aware individuals. Now you might say, yes, but Terry, most people aren't. You know, just look at the first page, you switch on something like YouTube, you go to the front page of YouTube, and what do you see on the front page of YouTube? Endless garbage. Right? Endless trash and triviality. So what's spiritually self-aware about that? Well, that's because we have to start, as it were, in the lower octave of me, myself, and I. And we have to rise from that egocentric individual who has lost contact with the Spirit to develop ourselves as self-aware individuals. And as I said, we have to apply our thinking to will the good. We have to integrate the gifts which we've developed through natural scientific thinking and training, in particular the concern for accuracy and objectivity in all that we do. Then we have to develop, because we're trying to become individuals. Becoming individuals means that necessarily we will have to be antipathetic. We have to say no to the groups, the old groups of family, church, peer group, and so on, that perhaps in some way wish to hold us back. We have to step out of them. This is the step which every teenager strives to make. Peer group or me. So there's antipathies involved in this process of becoming an I, an ego, a self. And because of that, our age is particularly focused on antipathy. There's a lot of antipathy. It's inevitable in our age. Therefore, we have to consciously work to develop sympathy and empathy. Now, if you go to certain cultures, for example, I experienced this when I was in Japan, you can see how some of these cultures have this from ancient times. It's an instinct, you see. It's an instinct to consider other people, to consider the periphery, not to interrupt other people when they're speaking. Very difficult for Westerners. But they have that from this ancient heritage. Our challenge is to develop it individually through our own work on ourselves. So we have to work developing sympathy and empathy in social settings. Also in this age of Pisces, we have seen the death of what are called the churchianity. Christianity as in the church form, that comes from the fourth epoch and even the third epoch. Doesn't belong to the fifth epoch. Church, the whole world of church is beautiful as those buildings are. Glorious works of art, many of them. But that is all destined to fail. Church life. But that does not mean that Christianity is destined to fail. Because the whole purpose of Christianity is about death and resurrection. So Christianity itself has to die in the old form of churches and resurrect. And I think that's what it's actually doing in individual human beings. And then we have to develop the true global consciousness. So we widen our consciousness beyond ourselves, beyond our nations, and take in awareness of the whole world. But this, of course, does not mean globalist consciousness in the sense of elitists, a global elite trying to control things. Now, working against us in this epoch are the forces of the spiritual counter-forces working through such things as the New World Order. And they have their own tasks. and their own ways in which they're seeking to frustrate our genuine, our justified tasks. And these tasks that they are seeking to achieve they're seeking to suppress the remaining elements from the fourth epoch. That's from the 4th and 15th century. That means the Latin cultures, particularly the French culture of Europe and the Spanish culture. They're seeking to finish them off. I'm talking about now, when I'm talking about the New World Order, I'm talking about those forces within the New World Order which are driven from particularly the English-speaking world. Because it's the English-speaking world which is in the driving seat in our epoch. They're also seeking to freeze the evolutionary process at the level of our epoch, so that it doesn't go on to the 6th epoch. And it remains at the level of materialism, it remains at the level of the ego, of the self-centered I. And they're seeking to block any cultural contribution from the Germanics, Germans, Dutch, Scandinavians, and so on. They wish that the overwhelming new ideas and new developments will come only from the English-speaking world. Well, you only have to switch on the BBC and listen to it for a week, and I've been listening to it for 30 years, to understand that this is exactly what they do. Hardly any ideas come into the BBC from the continent, except for Radio 3, where they're always playing continental classical music. But all the new ideas, about new ideas in science, new ideas in business, for example, politics, these they look over the Atlantic to America for. They're seeking to unite the Anglosphere and maintain its dominance from the 5th to the 6th epochs. This goes back to the 19th century, we'll talk about that a bit later. And they're seeking to block the embryonic Slavic elements, which are trying to prepare the 6th epoch, the future age of Aquarius. They're trying to block that from developing. They're trying to make sure that the Slavic elements take their lead only from the Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking cultures. And they're trying to promote supermaterialism, the culture of machine animals. They're seeking to turn us into machine animals, both before and after death, so that we continue these thoughts, we take these thoughts, these supermaterialistic thoughts, across the threshold into the spiritual world with us. And in the 5th cultural age, we're moving, as I said, from the 2nd to the 3rd phase. I'm sure some of you are aware that in esotericism, 7 is the number of time, 12 the number of space, and 5 the number of man, human being. Cultural ages of 2,160 years can be divided into 7 phases of 380 years each. So we see that we are the first phase of our epoch, 1413, 1721. The second phase is from 1721 to 2029. And if you study the history of that period, you'll see it was a period of great dualism and discord. And if you compare it with this period here, in the 4th epoch, 439 to 131. Again, I can't go into that now, just invite you to look at that. In 439 to 131 BC, and see if you can see similarities in these two periods. I believe it's quite obvious. But we are now, the key is that we're approaching in 7 years' time the beginning of the 3rd phase of our epoch, which will see in various ways new threefold impulses developing. This is the phase of trinity and balance. It corresponds to the period in the 4th epoch of 131 BC to 177 after Christ. So we're now approaching an imminent phase shift from 2029 onwards. As I mentioned before, the significance of the number 23, 2 and 3, is the struggle between dualism and trinity, or triadism. And you can see this number, if you pay attention, everywhere. In Hollywood, in the media, on TV, in the news. whether it's 23, whether it's 230, whether it's 2,300,000, 0.23, 2.3, 2/3, etc., etc. If you pay attention, you start to see this everywhere. And then you might say, well, Terry, isn't that the case with every number? Well, I can assure you it isn't. I've tried doing that. I've been interested in this number for over 30 years. So I've tried looking for other numbers in the same way. They don't crop up with the regularity of this number. And another very important thing happened in 2020. You may know that Jupiter and Saturn, two great planets of our solar system, which are traditionally associated with the future, Jupiter, and the past, Saturn, they meet each other. They have a conjunction every 20 years. And so every 20 years here, then 20 years here, then 20 years here, and so you get a triangle, an invisible triangle, rather like that invisible pentagram I mentioned earlier on, with Venus. Now we have an invisible triangle of the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn around the zodiac. And this triangle too rotates around the zodiac in the same way. And we see that as a result, as this rotating pattern goes through the four elements, I'm sure those of you who are familiar with astrology will know that the signs of the zodiac are associated with the four elements. Fire signs, earth signs, air signs, water signs, always in this order, by the way. So we see that a new impulse begins with the fire sign. That new impulse then consolidates in the earth signs. That same impulse which began here then loosens up when this meeting starts happening in air signs. And then finally, in water signs, it dissolves and fades away. So a new cultural impulse, which is determined by the meetings of Jupiter and Saturn, begins and cycles through 800 years. And here are some of the dates when this happened. But the one that's of interest to us is 1603. A new impulse came in the year 1603. That impulse consolidated in the 1840s. Earth signs, they began to meet in earth signs. And then in 2020, just 2 years ago, they began to meet in air signs. And then eventually they'll meet 200 years or so, they'll start meeting in water signs. Then that whole impulse will break down. Now you can ask yourself, what was this impulse that began in 1603? What was that impulse? We can talk about that later on. I have a thought about that. Because that impulse, which began in 1603 and consolidated, became very firm in the 1840s, and has been since the 1840s, is now loosening up. It's not exactly breaking down, but it's loosening up. New possibilities are arriving. Now we're going to pass on now from the zodiacal level to the planetary level, to the archangels. But before we do, you can see here, and again I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, that there are actually, in the traditional picture of the spiritual world, as presented, for example, in the book De Celesti Hierarchia by Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagus in the late 5th to early 6th centuries after Christ, we see that there are 9 levels of consciousness above ours. 9. And the 3 lowest of them are the angels, the archangels, and the archi, also known as the principalities. And above them, another 3, Exousiai, or Elohim, Dynamis, Kuriotes, also known by these abstract classical terms, powers, virtues, dominions. These are Latin terms, these are Greek terms. And then we have, above them, Ophanim, Cherubim, Seraphim, Ophanim also known as thrones. And here you see the characteristics of these 9. Now, for our point purpose tonight, the important thing here is with the angels, whereas the angels are concerned with us as individuals, and each one of us has a guardian angel. The archangels are concerned with guarding and looking after communities, whether these are tribes, nations, peoples, or any other kind of community. Now these ideas about the archangels were developed by Johannes Tritemius of Sponheim in Germany, in this period here, the late 15th century, who wrote this remarkable book on the 7 secondary causes, that is, intelligences or spirits who move the spheres according to God, which he presented to the Emperor Maximilian, Habsburg Emperor. A very wise man. And I'm not going to go through all of this, it's just to show you that in his book, he very rigidly, it has to be said, he very rigidly gives dates for these archangels, because there are particular archangels, you see, who have almost as if they are senior archangels. So they have a special task, and that task is to overlook for a smaller period of time, not 2,160 years, but according to Tritemius, 354 years and 4 months, to be specific. A particular period of time. And in that particular period of time, they work with the other archangels to bring forward particular peoples or particular folks to play specific roles in history during those times. So here we see the Michael, the archangel of the sun, Raphael, Saturn, and so on. And the important one again for us is the most recent one. We came out of the age of Gabriel, the moon archangel, in 1879. And you see that date is the same. Rudolf Steiner used slightly different dates, which are a little bit more vague than Tritemius's, which are very rigid, very fixed. But you see that the 1879 is the same date. And this is the key one. So since the time of 1879, we've been in the age of Michael. What is that? I'll come back to Mars in a minute. The age of Michael, which we're living in now, and which will continue until 2250 or 2300. Michael and Gabriel traditionally all stand at the gates of birth and death. Gabriel at birth, Michael at death. And whereas Gabriel's task is to bring us into this material world, out of the spirit, Michael's task is to take us out of this spiritual, out of the physical world into the spirit. So Michael is always related to the spirit, the world of spirit, and particularly to the sun within the world of spirit. So Michael is always concerned with expanding our consciousness, with the spiritualization of thinking, with idealism, with thinking the good, with spiritual philosophy, independence of thought, confronting evil, transparency, cosmopolitanism, not nationalism. Nationalism is more an impulsively Gabrielic type, where you identify with a particular a piece of the earth, so to speak, section of realm or region of the earth, and the people who live there, and the language they speak. Michael, that's not his concern, or her concern, or its concern, because these are archangels, so gender is nonsense. But we have to use one of them in earth languages. So you see that Michael is shown here weighing the souls. It's a medieval picture after death. And here Michael is shown in Coventry Cathedral confronting the spirit of evil. But in this age of Michael, there are shadows. Shadows of the Michaelic impulses. And those are, for example, computer languages. Michael wishes to go beyond thinking in words and concepts. But instead we develop computer languages. Michael wishes us to understand idealistic thinking and acting together with other human beings. But the counter-forces have developed the internet as a kind of mockery of that. Wonderful though it is in many respects. but it's dependent on earthbound technology. We talk about the cloud, but we all know that there is no cloud. It's just a mass of tubes in boxes, usually underground, enormous warehouses and so on. Micah is concerned with cosmopolitanism, so we get imperialism developing in the Michaelic age as the shadow of that. Micah is concerned with individualism, so we get new oligarchies, we get Elon Musks, we get new super-rich plutocrats emerging, and the oligarchies of the WEF getting together and deciding our fate for us. Micah is concerned with the sun, so we get people who are gold bugs, people who are concerned with physical gold. There are many, particularly in America, are simply obsessed in the present time with as massive as much gold as they can. And of course, the main challenge within the Micah time is the incarnation of Iron. So this brings me now to these three beings: Lucifer, Christ, and Iron. This very simple diagram shows, in a sense, in this U form, simply what has happened for us and the whole of our humanity in the physical earth, or the whole of the earth, I should say, condensing out of spirit, which are called supra-nature, not super-nature, supra-nature, above, beyond nature, condensing into nature, into physicality, and then dissolving again, and returning to spirit, but different from what we were. However, you see that here, when we get to this point of densest matter, we can also slip down into subnature. And that is the challenge where we are now, in our present time, in the 20th and 21st century, particularly through the forces of electromagnetism and nuclear energy. We can slip down into the realm below the organic realms of nature. And this is the great temptation, as we shall see. In occultism, it's called the eighth sphere, because these are the 7 conditions which the planet Earth and we ourselves have condensed down to. Here's our physical middle Earth. And then the 3 spiritual forms, conditions which lie in our future, if we make the right decisions. But if we don't, we will be drawn by the spiritual counterforces into their realm of the 8th sphere. Now there's a particular time period in this descent of ours, a period which lasts about 5,000 years, at the bottom of this curve, you could say. And at the bottom of this curve, that was the place where Christ incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth. And you had what Steiner called the mystery of Golgotha took place, where Christ was crucified, which of course is the place of the skull. It's the meaning of it. This is the darkest period, out of the spirit, down into earth reality, and then slowly back towards the spirit again. But during this 5,000 years, in this period of descent, and particularly this 5,000 year period here, we actually found our freedom and our individuality. So, in that sense, of course, not all dark at all. We are, as it were, let go by our parents, and we find our way by ourselves. Although, of course, also with their help from the spiritual world, human beings continually incarnating, who help us, the great sages and saints, are also continually incarnating out of spirit to help us, even in this 5,000 year period here. And so this dark age of discord, particularly the 5,000 years, that's where materialism grew strongest. But in 1900, the doors of perception began to reopen. Those doors of perception, what do I mean by that? I mean that imagine a time when the child is born, the child can see the whole spiritual world around her. It's all there. Not only the world of the fairies, but the whole world of the spiritual beings. Our ancestors had something like that in ancient times. And very gradually, as the planet and we condensed into matter, we lost this capacity. These doors closed. And they really closed for all but a very, very, very few who we call wizards or witches, wise old men, old women, who still had an inkling of that. But as we descended even into this dark period, people began to become afraid even of them. But in 1900, those doors began to reopen. And from that time, when people are born, since that time, we find that people are beginning to have glimpses, intimations, natural clairvoyance is returning, simply by virtue of being born as a human being. Of course, we all know that many children have certain experiences like this, and that was perhaps always the case, but children lose those experiences by and by. But from now on, it will grow stronger and stronger. That's another reason why, by the way, Ahriman, when he incarnates, has to make his move soon, when materialism is still very strong. So Steiner described how history is framed, so to speak, by three great incarnations of these three spiritual beings. The being of Lucifer, incarnated in China 3,000 years ago, being we call Lucifer. And we can ask, well, who was this being in China? Steiner says a few things about him, but not very much. I put a name there, I'll draw attention to it in a minute. But this being incarnated in China and brought tremendous gifts to Chinese culture at that time. And then Christ incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth in Palestine 2,000 years ago at the River Jordan at the baptism. And then, round about now, he said, Ahriman will incarnate in the West. And he didn't specifically point to the USA, but he dropped certain hints. If you read, you can read what he wrote about that in this book here, Lucifer and Ahriman, a series of lectures he gave in 1919 about these three incarnations. There we see these two beings. Before Christ, Lucifer was our main opponent, so to speak, the one that worked against us. Because Lucifer is the spirit of self-centered light, pride, and arrogance. And he wishes us not to descend into earth. Not to descend into material reality, but to remain above in his beautiful realm. Whereas after Christ, our main challenge comes from Ahriman, who says there is no spiritual world. Lucifer never says there is no spiritual world. The Luciferic beings always wish to draw you into the spiritual world, but only into their beautiful spiritual world. Their world, which is not connected in a sense to the rest of the spiritual world. Ahriman, however, denies the spiritual world, even though he's a spiritual being himself. That's his task, to fool us into thinking there is no spiritual world. And to connect only to the world of five-sense reality, the spirit of untruth, deception, and materialism. Steiner produced this enormous statue during the First World War with the English sculptress Edith Marion. That's how high a human being is. It's about 9 meters high. And then you see the representative of humanity. And here you see the Lucifer being is falling. And here you see the Ahrimanic being is kept in his place underground, as it were, amongst the the roots and down there amongst the minerals, as it were. It's simply a symbolic picture of the association of Ahriman with matter and Lucifer up in the clouds falling. But here, that you see them actually connected and wrestling with each other. And here I would submit that this is where they are wrestling within our souls. So they're wrestling in the macrocosm, so to speak, in the world of nature. And they're also wrestling within our souls. Up here, by the way, some people say, who's that up there? That's the spirit of cosmic humour. Having a good laugh at the whole process. This is the face of the representative of humanity. This is the face of Lucifer. And this is the face of Ahriman. There's Lucifer. This one here. And one possibility, I put this out as my own supposition. I can't stand behind this and say, I really feel this is definitely the case, but it's definitely a possibility that the Lucifer being, the incarnation, may be the being that we mentioned in China as the Yellow Emperor, Huan Di, the common ancestor of the Chinese people, and he invented all these things here. Early 3rd millennium. And still, particularly in Taiwan today, you see they greatly honour him. Here, the president and the leader of Taiwan paying respects to Huan Di, the shared ancestor of the Chinese people. Steiner's specific comment about the incarnation of Ahriman was that just as there was an incarnation of Lucifer in the flesh, and as there was an incarnation of Christ in the flesh, so even before a part of the 3rd millennium has run its course, there will be a real incarnation of Ahriman in the West, in the flesh. So as a human being, this spiritual force will appear as a human being for a certain number of years amongst us. And before that happens, Steiner pointed out that all these things will have to have happened. 1, the spread of the mechanistic view of the universe. 2, the social life has to be driven by economics. 3, the spread of nationalism. 4, the spread of party politics. 5, a literalist, Bible fundamentalist Christianity, only the letter of the text of the Bible. 6, intellectualization of life based on statistics. 7, the unconscious attitude to food and drink. The unconscious taking in of the spirit through food and drink. You think of fast food or junk food, for example. And lastly, there will be tremendous acceleration of inventiveness in physical life, in science and technology. And of course, all these things have already happened since 1919. Now, my own thoughts about the incarnation of this being, I've written on my website here, in this article, The Incarnation of Ahriman, When and Where. So my website is www.freeman.org, and there's the actual, that's the website, and that's the site for the article. If you want to see that, I can show you again later on. So, I can't make the presentation tonight. I will take a whole other lecture about why Ahriman is coming, is amongst us now. But if we're to understand what's going on at the present time, I think it's absolutely essential. If Ahriman was born in 2000, then of course he would be now 22. So assuming birth in May of 2000, as I do, and I show in my article why I think it occurred in May, it has to do with the astronomical and astrological events that happened in August of the year before, 1999, and then the events which happened 270 days later in May of 2000. Then we see, that in the first year he would be learning to stand and walk. Then by 2002 that being would be learning to speak. 2003 learning to think and say I to itself. 2007 approximately would be the change of teeth. In 2014 would be the puberty experience. 2019 November would be the first moon node. May 2021 would be adulthood, and November 2029 would be Saturn return. And again, I can only invite you to just think about what has happened in the past 20 years in relation to these periods of time. And we'll look at the last 21 years from this perspective. Such events as 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, UK, Animal Holocaust, 2001, surveillance state, global warming, paranoia, etc., etc. COVID, of course. Here's, I think, a very significant quote from Steiner. This comes from this book I mentioned. As soon as our money incarnates at the destined time in the West, the whole of culture will be impregnated with its forces. What else would come in his train? Through certain stupendous acts, he would bring to humanity all the clairvoyant knowledge which until then can be acquired only by dint of intense labour and effort. People could live on as materialists, they could eat and drink as much as may be left after the war, and there would be no need for any spiritual efforts. The Aramanic streams would continue their unimpeded course. When Araman incarnates in the West at the appointed time, he would establish a great occult school for the practice of magical arts of the greatest grandeur, and what otherwise can be acquired only by strenuous effort will be poured over mankind. Does that remind you of anything? Do you see anything like that happening in the world today? I think we do. I think we can see that this is beginning to happen through all the kinds of ways in which they are trying in Aramanic ways to connect our being to machines, our machines to our thought life, for example. All the phenomena such as Second Life, virtual reality, all these things. When you listen to this guy, Yuval Noah Harari, and I hope you've all been listening to him, the thinker, the philosopher of the World Economic Forum. When you listen to him, then it's almost as if you're hearing some of these things that Steiner was talking about, that Araman is going to bring about. And we know that Klaus Schwab has said that the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. And for Schwab, it's actually about changing us. It's not about changing the world. It's about changing who we are as human beings. And for Harari, it's about doing away with us as human beings. Doing away with us. So we become a different kind of being altogether, no longer an organic, biological being. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Something from the Great Reset, which is all these ideas are set forth in Schwab's book. And we have to notice things like this is from the diagram, the nested diagrams on the WEF Great Reset project in 2020. And when you have all these incredible, unbelievable, have you looked into that? Yeah? And you go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you see that they have thought of everything. And you click on any one of these things and it goes into more and more and more. Yeah? What you don't find there is very much about spirituality. But it's as if everything else is within this system. And by the way, you notice the inverted heptagon. You see inverted heptagons, inverted pentagrams in this system. The Great Reset will lead to a fusion of our physical, digital, and biological identities. And when royals and socialists and globalists all share the same agenda, say some people, it's time to become concerned. And here we see almost the Luciferic Aramanic contrast there, all in red, all in blue. The Great Reset all in blue, the Great reawakening or in red. Well, I don't wish to knock these people. They're doing what they can. Here's Mr. Zelenko, here's General Flynn. They're doing what they can to try and reawaken people, as they say, but often they're doing it in very traditional ways, like, for example, based on certain literalist readings of the Bible. And here's somebody who, again, is a person who, as it were, was almost presenting the ideas of Iron ahead of time. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former American National Security Advisor, said in his book, in Grand Chessboard, 1997, he spoke of a new web of global linkages is growing exponentially outside the more traditional nation-state system. That web, woven by multinational corporations, NGOs, and scientific communities, and reinforced by the internet, already creates an informal system that is inherently congenial to more institutionalized and inclusive global cooperation. In the course of the next several decades, a functioning structure of global cooperation based on geopolitical realities could thus emerge and gradually assume the mantle of the world's current regents, he means the USA, which has for the time being assumed the burden of responsibility for world stability and peace, the USA. Geostrategic success in that cause would represent a fitting legacy of America's role as the first, only, and last truly global superpower. You see, these people are thinking beyond the nation state, of course. So Brzezinski's concern is not for America at all. His concern is for the new paramount global state of the future. And he's dead now. He died a couple of years ago, in 2017. But his torch is being carried on in various ways by Mr. Schwab and Mr. Harari. And then, but of course, it's not just him. You have to look at the various people and the sponsors who are the trustees of the board of trustees of the WEF and see who they are. People like Larry Fink of BlackRock, for example. So the fourth industrial revolution will affect the very essence of our human experience, says Mr. Schwab. However, on the other side of things, we have people who wish to not look at that and instead go back into the past, the ancient past, not into this super high-tech Aramanic future, but back into the ancient past. So this is a German-Scandinavian rock band called Heilung, which means healing, and they try to reimagine the music of in northern Europe around about 200, 300 AD. Quite a phenomenon. You can see them on YouTube. And become very popular very rapidly. Just a symbol of where many people want to go. Another symptom of where many people want to go. You want to find your tribe. Yeah? This yearning for tribal consciousness. This yearning to overcome what is seen as selfish individualism, but it's put in terms of the ancients. It's reconnecting with the ancients, reconnecting with the ancestors, reconnecting with the ancient tribes. This is one of the ways in which many people in the New Age movement have react against the kind of thing that Schwab and Harari are trying to bring into the world. But this polarity we see very strongly, we've seen it for 20 years now, in the world of entertainment and media. In, of course, what's represented in Matrix and what's represented in The Lord of the Rings. Two very different movies, but they are basically speaking about the same thing. What is that one same thing? It is that a tremendous force is coming towards humanity. A tremendous force. A force which is seeking to control all of us. And that force is represented, of course, in different ways. Machine-animal force here. And here is represented by the occultic power of Sauron, in a kind of Dark Ages, early Middle Ages context, from Tolkien. But it's the same thing. And these two trilogies, both trilogies, notice, These two trilogies both appeared as we passed from the second millennium to the third millennium, around the time of the millennium. Here we see CERN. Of course, you can't see that great CERN, that's the view from space, but that's how big it is. The CERN Research Centre, Particle Physics Research Centre in Switzerland, and there it is underground. Then there's the other ring. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness find them. And we are encouraged by the media to put our faith in this ring, in this approach to reality. And then in world geopolitics, we see that we are faced in this 21st century by these two. The world of the ancient incarnation of Lucifer, the world of the coming present incarnation, I would submit, of Armin. And I deliberately put Europe very squashed here, because I think that's where it is, squashed between these two. This is what we have to face in the 21st century. These two facing off each other as Armin comes into incarnation. Because these two, like Hitler and Stalin, sometimes, usually work against each other, but sometimes they collaborate. As they've done over COVID, for example. So we have to steer our way, like Odysseus, between Scylla and Charybdis, the whirlpool. The whirlpool will destroy the whole ship. Scylla, the monster, just ate up a few of the crew, so Odysseus steered clear closer to Scylla. But through this way, they got through the Straits of Messina, Scylla and Charybdis. We have to steer our way. Humanity has to steer its way between America and China. I'm not going to quote all of this from Yuval Noah Harari. If you don't know him, I would just again say, please go and see what he says. He's talking about hacking human beings. He's talking about there is no free will anymore. There is no spirit. There is no soul. Science is not about truth. It's about power. The most important place in religion today is Silicon Valley. That's where the new religions are being created now by people like Ray Kurzweil, he says. I hope you're familiar with Ray Kurzweil and his book, The Age of Spiritual Machines. These are the religions that will take over the world, says fellow dual citizen, Noah Harari. But behind all of this is the incarnation of Armin and the inspiration of materialism. It's a difficult and dangerous stage we have to pass through. Just as human individuals have to pass through adolescence and get into the 20s through the gates of 21. So in the year 869, Steiner pointed out how the spirit was abolished by the church. And that might seem a strange thing to say, and it's rather complicated to go into. I have an article about that on our website. But the point is that in that year, in 869, the Council of the Church in Constantinople, in that very church of the Holy Spirit, Hagia Sophia, a council took place which effectively said that the human being has only one rational and intellectual soul, by which they meant you have an intellectual and rational soul, you do not have a higher soul, which is actually that part of your being which can take you, guide you to the spirit. It was a teaching of the twin souls, of the two souls, the lower soul which pays attention to the body, and the higher soul which pays attention to the spirit. And the council insisted, through various sly, devious things that were done at that council, that the spiritual soul was left out. That's the pneumaticus anthropos, spirit man, of which St. Paul talks in the New Testament, and which Aristotle spoke about. That was done away with. And that had tremendous consequences in the following centuries. both amongst Catholic and Protestant theologians. Even after the Reformation, the Protestants did not realise the consequences of that abolition of the Spirit. And that's why, even today, in advertising, for example, people say a lot about body and soul, body and soul, body and soul, and not body, soul, and spirit. Sometimes people talk about body, mind, and soul. But spirit is something else. And that's where, Steiner pointed out, that's where that was first done away with, back in 869. The soul was abolished by Marxist philosophy and by behaviourist psychology in the 19th and 20th centuries. They decided we don't have a soul either. Everything is done by the physical brain. And now, as I said, we're at the point of abolishing the body, which will be a human sui genocide. Anthropocide, if you will. So our physical vehicle will now be something else than organic. It will be perhaps ceramic, or it will be mineral. The whole idea that humans have this soul or spiritual freedom, that's over, says Rudolf. The new religions from Silicon Valley and Bangalore are likely to give people visions based on technology, eternal life here on earth. This is what we face with today, folks. The end of humanity as we know it. We've got to look this in the face and understand what this is. It is a spiritual power, a spiritual force. And it's what's coming in the cloak, as it were, in the atmosphere of the incarnation of Ahriman. That has to happen. And Ahriman is giving us all these technical gifts, like this very one I'm using right now. All these technical gifts which he's giving us. But along with all these technical gifts come the ideas of people like this, and this, and this, and these two. Gates and Musk. Yeah? And it's these ideas which are actually more dangerous. Because they have an impact on what we are and how we understand ourselves as human beings. If we take in these ideas, if we begin to act according to them, then we will cease to be human beings. And we have to look this in the face. And this is the point of the Age of Michael. That's what the Age of Michael is about. That's what Michael, Archangel, wants us to do. To look this in the face, not to run away from it, but to look it in the face, to try and understand it, see what and who is behind it. Right. I must come to an end. I will say something a little bit more hopeful at the end. In 1910, Sweden, Steiner began to talk about the coming reappearance of Christ in the etheric world, the realm of the angels. And because of this return of natural clairvoyance I mentioned earlier, at the end of that 5,000 years of darkness, then people would, from the year 1933, note that number, begin to perceive the etheric Christ in the form of an angel, Christ born by an angel, just as he was born by a human being 2,000 years ago. And what then came from the side of Ahriman in 1933? Well, you all know what came then. What came then was the Holodomor. What came then was Hitler. What came then was what Stalin did to the people of Russia and to the people of Ukraine. But Steiner pointed out that people would begin to have sight of the Christ from 1933 onwards. Such vision was experienced even during World War II, and even in terrible conditions. People perceived the Christ in the etheric world. And you can read about this, for example, in the book They Experienced Christ, Reports for an Investigation by the Institute for Religion and Sociology, published in Stockholm in 1980. And since the end of the war, awareness of the biosphere and the angelic etheric realm has steadily grown, as we all know. The environmental movement, the ecology movement, people encountering angels, all of this is part of this new awareness of the etheric realm. That realm, lowest realm of the spiritual world, just beyond our physical realm. So you have people like Lorna Byrne talking about angels, and many other people having personal encounters. This is growing and growing. as well as all of these technological developments. And in the fourth millennium, so after our epoch, at that time, Christ will then be born by an archangel, not an angel. 2,000 years ago, he was born by a human being. Now, he's born by an angel in the etheric world. And in the future, he'll be born by an archangel in the astral world. And another aspect of this Christ event is that this new rhythm I mentioned, which Steiner began to speak about in December 1917, interestingly enough, on the 23rd of December, a new rhythm in human history. So this is not based on the traditional astrological rhythms, as I mentioned earlier on. This is a rhythm which is related directly to the 33 and the 30 years of Christ on earth. And that is that all social events, good or bad, experience a kind of resurrection, a kind of reappearance in some form or other, 33, 66, and 99 years later. And of course, we can only convince ourselves of this by studying history and current events. So, those of you who are interested in education will know that the child develops through 3 7-year phases. Develops different soul faculties in these three 7-year phases, 7 to 14 to 21, and those are marked by physical developments which become more subtle as we grow up. But if you look at the centuries from this point of view, 3 times 33 and a third years is a century, of course. And if you look at the centuries from this point of view, and I can only again recommend you to look at the 7th century events, the 14th century events, and now the 21st century events from this point of view, and see how they reflect developments that happen in the life of the individual. And then we can look back at these years I mentioned earlier, 1989, 1956, 1923, and look at the events which happened. Because there's a certain resonance that's going on between what's happening now and what happened at those times, which we all lived through. Well, except for the ones in 1923. Most of us in this room lived through all these things. We can remember some of them. And finally, on the dark side, so to speak, is this question of the 666 being. 666, 1332, 1998. And this is this being mentioned in the book of Revelation 666, which is a being which is not Ahriman. And this being, unlike Ahriman and Lucifer, never incarnates physically on earth, but always strikes into human history in these 666 years, periods, after Christ. And the first of these events was in what is now Iran, in the Academy of Gandhi-Shapur, which existed from this period, 530 to 850, which is like a kind of intellectual hothouse at that time. And the goal here was by bringing together all the accumulated wisdom in such a way that humanity would have been prematurely drenched with this wisdom, ahead of time, so to speak. And that would have had tremendous negative consequences. We weren't supposed to advance at that speed. In 660, by the way, at the centre of the Academy of Gandhi-Shapur was the School of Medicine. It was particularly famous for medicine. And then 1332, the event that Steiner mentioned in relation to the second attack by this being Sorach, the counterintelligence of the sun, so this is a counter-sun being, S-U-N, is the destruction of the Knights Templar by Philip IV, the King of France, who was not only obsessed with gold, but also wished to destroy the Templars because they refused to accept his desire for him to lead a new order. The Templars and Hospitallers, the merged into one order which he would lead. They refused to accept that. And he was also hard up for gold. He'd already persecuted the Jews to get their money, and now he wanted to persecute the Templars to get their money, because I'm sure you know they were some of the first international bankers. So, however, I noticed that in 1332, that wasn't actually the time when the Templars were destroyed. The Templars were destroyed between 1307 and 1314 in France. Some of them survived in other European countries after that, but the destruction was between 1307 and 1314. So why was Steiner talk about 1332? Because it's connected with 666. He also talks about the previous life of Philip IV, which was particularly dark. But the other thing about Philip IV, which you know, is that he was the first really modern European king to develop a modern state system with royal bureaucrats. So very we see a new impulse there, a strong centralized government, you could say. And then finally, 1998, around that time, we see the strong anti-globalization movement about the debt redemption or debt forgiveness at that time. And then a couple of years later, we see 9/11, which of course is an incredible counter-force attack in itself. You can see all the counter-forces at work in that event: Lucifer, Aaron, and Sora. But I think it's particularly interesting. These, by the way, are the traditional sigils or glyphs associated in esotericism with Sora, the two horns of the beast. So, what I noticed from this here is that there's actually a kind of a window. It's not only in 1 year that this happens, but there's a window from 1307, 1332, 1357, so 25 years either side of 1332. 1307, 1357. And if you then map that window on either side of 666 and either side of 1998, then, for example, in this period, you'll come to 1973 and 2023. So it's not only 1 year that Sora is active. That's the kind of the center point of the window of activity where he's striking into human affairs. But the period is from 1973 to 2023, next year. And again, we've all lived through this period, so we all know what happened during that time. One very important thing that I will draw your attention to that happened during that time was in 1973, David Rockefeller went to China. And who did he meet in China? He met number 2 in China, Zhou Enlai. He didn't meet Mao Zedong, he met Zhou Enlai. And Zhou Enlai was the political mentor of Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, of course, was the man who then, in 1978, opened China up to world capitalism. So China's entrance into the world economy really stems from what Deng Xiaoping did, who was influenced by his mentor, Zhou Enlai, who always had a kind of a very interesting figure, always had a kind of leaning towards the West. And it was him that David Rockefeller met, the mentor of Deng Xiaoping. And it's because these Western elitists wanted to bring China into the world economy. They wanted to involve China in conflict with America that we see what's going on at the moment. Just a couple of slides about the three periods, the 3 years of the windows. So that's a summary of what we have, where we are in the year currently, and I realise I haven't got even anywhere near into Russia and Ukraine, but I can sort of sum that up very quickly by saying that I think we can understand the struggle between Russia and Ukraine Exoterically, it's quite easy to understand. Exoterically, it is the British had a fear of losing India. Russia was after France. France was defeated, Napoleon, 1815. After that, the next power that was identified that could take India from us was Russia. So the British elite began to focus on Russia. Negative propaganda stepped up on Russia throughout the 19th century. The great game then began. It was fear and paranoia on the part of Britain because we were addicted as a culture to India in many respects. Psychologically addicted, physically addicted. And so we addicted the Chinese to opium from the opium which was grown in British India in raw. But it was fear. It was fear of losing India, which turned us against Russia. Then, in the 20th century, the second fear was a fear that Russia and Germany would get together. But not only Germany, Russia and any other very intelligent, disciplined, energetic culture, like Japan, for example. So the British set up, the Americans funded the Russo-Japanese War to turn Russia and Japan against each other. So the British did a diplomatic revolution and became friends with the Russians for 7 years, from 1907. So we could involve the Russians in a war with Germany and turn Russia and Germany against each other. This was laid forth by Alfred Mackinder, the founder of British geopolitics, in 1904. It was vital for the British Empire that Germany and Russia should be kept apart. Brzezinski followed on those ideas from Alfred Mackinder, and you can see those ideas also followed on by the geopolitician, geostrategist George Friedman in a YouTube lecture he gives in 2015, where he's asked what is the primordial danger or threat for the United States. And he says in his lecture there, you can still see this on YouTube, it's called Europe Destined for Conflict, ? February the 4th, 2015. And he's asked, what is the real threat, the existential threat to the United States? Is it ISIS? And he says, no, it's not ISIS. The primordial threat to the United States has always been the combination of Germany and Russia, and for that, to prevent that, we have fought 2 world wars and the Cold War. Now, no other British or American politician ever has said anything like that. But that's a real key to understand what the 20th century was about. To keep Germany and Russia at odds, and never to let them come together. And we've seen in recent years, the whole question of Nord Stream 2 is about the same thing. And the drive of Alfred Mackinder to say that world power is based on who controls Central Asia and who controls the resources of Central Asia and Siberia. And it is vital that the Anglo-Americans somehow gain those resources from Russia. And this is the long-term goal in the physical sense in the 20th century and the 21st century still today. So the goal is eventually to break Russia up. So eventually to turn Russia and China against each other. That'll happen later on, a little bit later on in this century, and then pick them off one by one, so that Russia will lose everything east of the Urals, and then European Russia can be drawn into a transatlantic Europe. That's the long-term strategy. I presented all of this, but I'm afraid I ran out of time. And you can read about it in various things that I've written in UVU magazine, for example. But the esoteric problem, or the esoteric reason for the Russia-Ukraine struggle, is part of the ongoing, I touched on a little bit earlier on, which is to make sure that the Slavic peoples do not do what they're supposed to do in the 6th epoch. To freeze the 5th epoch where it is now, under the control and at the lower self-centered ego level of where our Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American culture is at the moment. It doesn't mean to say it will be on into the future, but where it is now, so that we do not get beyond this egotistical phase and start to develop true spiritual self-autonomy, self-awareness, and the beginnings, just the beginnings, of spiritual community. So we have to push the Slavs away, so that the Slavs will be pushed towards China, which will then turn upon them later on. And they will either destroy each other, but certainly China will seek to take what Russia has in Siberia, and then the West will move against China. This is the strategy which you can see laid out in many of the American geopolitical think tanks and in various forms. And unfortunately, Ukraine is being used as the battering ram. That might seem strange because you might think, well, surely Russia's invading Ukraine, isn't it? But actually, no. What's really going on here is that Ukraine is being used as the battering ram against Russia. And that what will result from this war will be, in the intention of the Western powers, the weakening of Russia, the downfall of Russia. And Alfred the Kinder in 1919, his father of Anglo-Saxon geopolitics, he produced a very pithy three-line epithet, which was he who commands Eastern Europe. Sorry, he who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland. By heartland, he meant Central Asia, Siberia. He who rules the heartland commands the world island. By the world island, he meant Eurasia as a whole. And he who rules Eurasia commands the whole world. This is a key to understanding Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American geopolitics, which is actually playing out in front of us today. And Ukraine is being used as the unfortunate instrument of this geostrategy. So I think I'll stop there. I don't know whether we've got any time at all.
You've got 2 minutes for a
2
question.
minutes. Does anybody want to put forward a question? 2 minutes. Let's see what I can manage.
What was the YouTube video you said that you were to watch? Something Friedman, was it George?
Yeah, it's George Friedman. George Friedman, and it's called Europe Destined for Conflict, question mark. And it's the 4th of February 2015, YouTube. If you just put George Friedman 2015, it'll come up. And you have to go to about the 50s, you have to go to the Q&A bit. That's what's so interesting, because in the Q&A, it gets a bit more spontaneous. And it's interesting, when they say, what is the quintessential problem for the United States? He says it's not ISIS, and he says why it's not ISIS. He could have stopped there. He didn't. And then he went on to say what the quintessential problem of the United States is. That was so revealing.
I think we have to stop there. Ladies and gentlemen, Terry Boardman.
Thank you.
The information where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.